I'm really passionate about focusing on the end users. So if you're building a learning and development program, I would love for people to do more of an audience analysis and have that as a core focus of what they're building. And that's what's on my mind. I'm Harold, and this is my Curious Corner. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me on this very fun episode. We are nearing the end of Story Arc 2, which has been all about skills, the future of work, how does skills work. And I wanted to stretch a little bit on the story arc and get some very interesting perspectives. So to join me in that fun rabbit hole, I have Sam. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Sam.
Thanks for having me on.
Sam and I used to be colleagues, actually, where I am currently, and you've worn many hats between going from building customer education programs, working for tech vendors, and now doing consulting, and also been diving really deep into this topic of experience design. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that means. And the reason I think this is relevant is the time we're at currently is it's hard to get people to engage with technology. There's consolidation going on, and a lot of people are not necessarily wanting to engage with things above what they're forced to do. So how did you get into experience design?
As you alluded to, I've sat in many different chairs across the course of my career. I actually started my career as a traditional marketer, digital marketer, spent a few years on the agency side before joining Shopify in 2015, right after they'd IPO'd. Definitely played the jungle gym there. That's what we used to call it. So bounced around across very many different roles, many different teams, and eventually landed in customer education. I was in customer success when I first joined the organization. And inevitably, as it happens, you sort of start to notice that some things we're doing aren't scalable. We need to introduce different programs that will allow us to better service our larger customers. And so that's kind of where the customer ed program was born, and eventually ended up leading the global customer education team for a few years there. I left in 2022, joined a seed stage startup, and then ended up at Docebo. And it was awesome because I was able to switch back into marketing, but specifically for a technology that I had developed a very, very huge passion around. If it hasn't been evident to people who might be listening who know me, I am a huge learning tech nerd. The tech is actually what gets me up out of bed every morning, very obsessed with the actual technology side of things, the data architectures, the systems integration, the things that actually power the experience is what's most interesting to me. And being able to be part of a team taking that stuff to market, creating the story, creating the narrative was obviously an incredible opportunity for me. After leaving Docebo, I decided, you know what? I have all of this experience doing this stuff, both on the buyer side as someone who led these teams, and then also from the vendor side. Why not kind of provide this expertise to the market and see if I can support organizations in not only growing their, whether it be customer education, learning and development, doesn't really matter. We'll get into that. But I kind of see those as one and the same a little bit when you think about it from the experience lens, but not only helping teams sort of grow their programs, set in place their programs, and really think about personalized orchestration of these experiences at scale, but also working directly with learning technology organizations in sort of optimizing their narrative to make sure that they're servicing the customers appropriately, the customers are able to leverage the technology appropriately, and everyone wins. So to get back to your question about experience design, I consider experience the foundation of everything that we do in not only learning, but just in when you think about your ability to grow as a business. If you are an executive and you are wanting to grow your business, everything comes down to the experience, because your employee experience is going to dictate people's performance and their ability to drive the organization in the direction that you want it to go, right? And so all of that stuff deeply, deeply matters. And then, of course, on the customer side, from a customer experience perspective, your customers need to experience value in order to stay with the product long term, in order to renew, avoid churn, have a positive experience. And so experience really is the foundation of a business's ability to grow, full stop. That's kind of my perspective on things.
We've also seen the other side of what happens when you don't do this. So let's say organization buys talent marketplace and they buy learning system and they're just rolling out everything. No one's thought change management. No one's thought, how do I build consumer grade experiences? So what tends to happen is some people engage, but the vast majority of the audience is either unaware, but they don't really see the relevance of this. So too many tech products are bought without thinking of the marketing of them as such. So another ingredient I want to add to our, let's say, experience design backpack as we're going here is the idea of approaching skills-based experiences, customer education, employee experiences through this idea of a product mindset, which is also interesting as you were on the kind of product marketing side. So how would you define the product mindset and its relevance when you're thinking about experience design?
This is such an interesting topic to discuss because I had the good fortune of working with Chris Metcalf really early on when I first joined Docebo. And honestly, he was the catalyst in so many ways to my thinking around this. When I was at Shopify, a lot of the ways that I led my team and the way that we ran our customer education program was built around this idea of a product mindset. So fundamentally, the way that we operated was designed around experiments. So pick a problem, like identify friction in the customer journey, run an experiment, right? Run a sprint in product world, validate that your solution is actually driving the expected impact against a KPI, some sort of leading indicator, and then continue to optimize that through sprints until it drives the lagging indicator that we expect to see. That's how I ran my teams. And so then meeting Chris and sort of for the first time being like, oh, that's a product thing. That was so ingrained in us in the way that we worked at Shopify that it kind of became second nature. But then having the language, having real methodologies to apply to the way that we worked was so honestly career changing for me in so many ways. And I have Chris to thank for that. And it showed up. It was really interesting because the work that we were doing, obviously, the work that I did was not only, a lot of it had to do with brand storytelling, sort of developing the narrative to be able to sell the products, but that only takes you so far. So like having the beautiful story and having the value propositions and the benefits well thought out takes you part of the way there. That's obviously important. But if your execution of the customer experience doesn't match with the story that you're telling to the market, you will inevitably not get as far as you could go. And that's where working with Chris really closely around customer journey mapping, doing service design blueprints with customers, really trying to get into the weeds and understanding all of their pain points, the friction points that they were experiencing, but also from our perspective as an organization, like how many handoffs are there in the customer experience? What are we doing behind the scenes? What does our technology stack look like? Where might there be missing points of data and tracking that are preventing us from being able to deliver on this experience? And that was the moment where it like solidified, oh my gosh, this is the thing that every organization needs if they want to be able to deliver on some sort of optimized experience. It all starts there.
I think the definition of customer is getting quite blurred because if we imagine a learning technology as a premise, it serves the user. That might be on the employee side, it might be a partner, it might be a customer. And the idea is we're architects building experiences. And that is the same from customer or product side. So the idea of the product mindset is learn, measure, repeat, or learn, build, measure. And you do that cycle. And there's a big issue in the internal world of skills and as well as learning and development. And throughout this arc, I've chatted to different people like Sandra Laughlin, Kareem Pagano. So we're saying we need to be clear on how skills fits in here. We need to be clear on the problems we're solving. So the product mindset almost forces you by design and the cyclical nature of it to actually prove that you solved the problem. It's almost a scientist mind, but built into products.
That's exactly correct. So there's two things that you just shared that I want to sort of extrapolate a little bit. Number one, the customer language, so important. And I think that's lost on a lot of internal, whether it's talent development, L&D, whatever teams, they tend to not think in that customer mindset. At the end of the day, everything is customer. The user that you're serving, the learner that you're serving in this context is a customer of yours, whether they're internal or external doesn't really matter. And this is where I think blurring the lines between internal and external education and learning, I'm starting to see this more and more, because when you remove some of those labels and you really just think about it from the product mindset, from that product lens, they're a customer. It's your duty to provide value to your customer through whichever means possible. Usually that means removing friction such that they can do their job better, thereby achieving more value, thereby improving their productivity and their performance, and then driving business results, right? That's the cyclical nature that you sort of referred to. That's one thing that I find is really, really critical. The other thing is, when you think about a product team and the way that they work, everything is designed around the idea of breaking things down into the minimal viable thing that you can deliver that moves the needle on a specific outcome that you're trying to drive. And so it shifts the mindset from outputs, which I think is typical in learning development teams, customer education teams. It's like, I know I need an onboarding program. I know I need, XYZ things. And so I'm just going to deliver it. I'm just going to put this stuff out there. That's outputs. We can't operate like that anymore, because it disconnects you from the ability to drive the results that you need to achieve for the business. And so when you start to think about it from that outcomes lens, it forces you to run in sprints. It forces you to think about, what leading indicators should I be focused on that are going to connect to this lagging indicator that the business wants to see from me and my team? And so what can I do in the smallest minimal viable piece that's going to deliver on this leading indicator? And you just keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that. And the reason why I think this is actually foundational for people who are thinking about shifting to skills-based is, at the end of the day, if you're trying to develop skills within your organization to increase skills proficiency amongst your customers, your employee base, your workforce, you need to also think about removing friction. You can't have one without the other. Optimizing for skills is only going to take you so far. If the experience of work is garbage and they can't actually get their job done, then who cares that they have developed all these skills, right? You're still not going to get the expected result. And so coupling those two things together, being able to identify friction, remove it such that they are able to do their job to the best of their ability, and then also increase their skills proficiency, those two things is what drives the workforce to be high performing.
The second point of what you mentioned there, Sam, is, so let's say table stakes on internal employee training or learning side. I have to do compliance once a year. Maybe I have to do a program because it's mandated from the top down. The skills journey by default, because you're asking someone to do it from the bottom up and because it benefits them, it's not forced. It's like, we encourage you to do it. So if the experience assigned is not there, you're essentially adding that friction and people aren't going to engage. You might have the best product in the world, but if the consumer experiences of how it feels to be in there is terrible, no one is going to work with it. So I think that's the new reality, that people assume people will engage in these programs. It's the idea of build it and they will come. The nature today is there's so many tools, there's so many things going on. So unless it's a really high people experience or high grade people experience, the skills initiative will essentially die out. So curious, from your teaching and working with Chris on PX as a product and looking at experience design, how have you seen some of the organizations actually nail that part of the people experience?
Yeah, it all comes down to, this is why I started with the topic of customer journey mapping and service design. I think that's the best starting point for learning and development teams to be able to optimize for the experience. Because if we remove the label of employee and customer, and all of them are customers, right? So when we use the language customer journey map, doesn't matter the label, doesn't matter who it's for. And you think about it from the lens of their end-to-end experience with your organization. So before they ever even join the company, what do your recruitment practices look like? Is your employer brand aligned to the experience that they're having as they're being recruited into your organization? Is it frictionless? Then when they onboard, is that experience frictionless? Do they see career pathways for themselves? Do they see opportunities for growth? Is there value in the same way that we would think about time to value on the customer education side, right? Reducing time to value such that they can deliver or they can achieve whatever outcomes that they purchased the product for. It's kind of the same thing on the employee side. are you able to reduce friction and optimize the experience such that their ramp time improves, they are able to get to productivity as quickly as humanly possible, and that there are pathways for them to be able to continue accelerating their career, because that lends itself to increased not only performance for them, but results for the business, right? The more career pathways there are, the more opportunities for growth there are, the more these employees want to stay, they are retained into the organization, they're better able to deliver on results. So the customer journey mapping piece is so critical, because once you map out that end-to-end journey and you know what it looks like, you can see very clearly often where there are gaps in the experience. And that's where you want to focus on, again, like removing any barriers, addressing or implementing programs where you might fix that. So if you don't even have career pathways, if you don't have job level frameworks, if you don't have some of those fundamental things that a skills-based sort of function would rely on in order to even identify skills proficiency, to be able to grow them and optimize their skills in certain areas, that's a good starting point. So that's why I think like the customer journey mapping exercise is usually such an eye-opening experience for organizations, because as soon as they do that, it's like, oh, I get it. I see why we've been having drop off here, or why, our NPS scores aren't so awesome here or at this point in the journey. It's like, well, yeah, because you aren't actually offering them the maximum amount of support in these areas. And by addressing that, usually you'll start to see, a ton of improvements that will eventually lead to the business results that you want to see.
And I'll give a specific example here. So if we look at the consumption experience of learning, one example here of how do you optimize and remove friction? A lot of organizations are using MS Teams, and that might say, well, a lot of people can do this. You add a hyperlink and you go into the LMS, but that's just a link. It's not a native experience. If you can consume from within that, salespeople, you consume inside Salesforce, MS Teams, you move in there. That's the definition of learning in the flow of work, right? It's frictionless. It's at the moment. There's ideas with AI agents doing this. I don't necessarily mind the medium in which it's done, but that's the consumer grade experience. That's frictionless. So if you can rate skills, if you can find learning where you live, whether that's a headless interface or Teams or Salesforce, you name it, that's what it takes for people to engage. Because if it's like you're bouncing around a bouncing ball, they're actually not going to be doing it, because you've architected an experience that's not seamless, it's not integrated in the back end, and it makes it hard for them to do what they're needing to do.
100%. And I would add, not only is it critical from an experience standpoint for the learning to be embedded in the flow of their work, but almost more importantly, that provides you the tracking that you need to then identify skills proficiency beyond self-reported functions, right? And you need that in a digital first world. The world that we live in today, 90% of the work that we're doing is digital. It's within, software products. And so when you think about that, this is why I think, again, the lines start to become really blurred between customer ed and employee development, talent development, because if 90% of the work that we're doing is inside software products, whether that's, MS Teams, Slack, think of all the tools that you use in your day-to-day, a CRM, Gong, there's a million different things that you're using. And so you're logging into all of these systems. All of these systems have the ability to track your performance, because I can guarantee that the customer ed team on the other side of that tool of Salesforce, of Gong, they're looking at that stuff so that they can optimize for your experience. But oftentimes, your learning and development team is not looking at that in the same way, right? And that's where I think there's such a big disconnect, and why there's so much power in shifting to an embedded model where learning is happening in the flow of work, because not only is that experience frictionless, but you have the ability to track their behavior. You have the ability to see what they're doing across all of these tools. That helps to paint a picture of, are they performing to the level that we expect? What does that even mean? And so the tracking is actually the most important component. And that's where I think a lot of teams end up. It's kind of like the second step, right? If customer journey mapping and service design is the first most important piece to start from there, the second thing to get to this mecca of orchestration and personalization at scale, you need a data architecture that connects the dots across all of these systems so that you can see, how is my customer, my learner, interacting with all of these things, and how is that driving their performance? How is that impacting the outcomes that I want to be able to see? How is that driving my business forward?
I had a fun discussion with Sandra about that. Like, how do you measure a skills proficiency? And it was mixing self rating, it was manager rating, and objective ratings from external gigs, things
Right?
you've done. Like, we're not just living within the confines of our comms platform internally. We're doing all kinds of things. Like, I'm speaking at a conference, that should count towards my skills profile. And it was another idea that the skills shouldn't necessarily be hosted only in the learning platform, but it should be that tailored experience where, and coming back to experience design you mentioned, it has skills as a component, but it has all the other aspects that I need as an employee to essentially succeed. But I think the red pill, blue pill moment to make it to the matrix for a lot of learning and development teams is something I think is very true in customer education, where you realize people don't have to engage with this. If you think everyone will engage and you don't realize that there will be that issue with people actually accessing it, then you may not think I actually need to map the customer journey. So I think like realizing you need to do that as a first step is a critical point to then go on the journey that we're talking about.
Absolutely, 100%. I think it also starts to sort of lend itself to maybe a different frame of mind for educators, which is like, yes, you can go about creating some more sort of standard programs, and sometimes those things are really necessary. If you have a very complex product, a very technical product, you will inevitably require much more robust learning pathways, some sort of dedicated onboarding program, maybe a certification. Those things don't go away. They're still incredibly important. But what I think we start to shift towards is less of a, I have to do these things because I know that in customer education, I'm supposed to do these things. And it shifts us into, what's the problem that the customer is experiencing? How can I make it easier for them to use my product? And therefore, it doesn't really matter what program you're delivering or how you're delivering it. If you think like a marketer, for example, so I know I'm biased because I am a marketer. And I had a marketing background before I shifted into customer education, but marketers don't necessarily focus on the channel that they're delivering content on. They're trying to drive a result, which is like driving leads for the business, increasing pipeline. And so which channels can I pull as levers to drive that result that I want to see? I'm going to be thinking about publishing my content across multiple channels, measuring the performance of that content across those channels, and then optimizing or pushing certain content more on some channels that I know are reaching the right people based on the results that I'm seeing, based on whether leads are increasing, pipeline is growing, is the pipeline growing in the areas that I want to see it. So if I'm trying to move up market, right? Like all these things you're thinking about. The same thing can and should be true of customer ed professionals. We should be thinking in that way. You have multiple channels at your disposal. Your academy, your LMS is one of them, but you've got your community, you've got in-app, you've got your knowledge base, you've got your website, you've got social. These are all channels that are at your disposal. Email is another one. So when you start to kind of like remove the idea of delivering a program on an academy and therefore needing to market it, thinking about how I'm going to get people to engage, pull them into the experience, all these things that we tend to think of when we're thinking very like linearly or in this like one, this is what I'm supposed to do. If you stop thinking that way, you don't really have to think so much about pulling them in and engaging, because they're going to want it, because you're serving them in the moment of need on the channel that they are already at. And so just by nature of doing that, you're already removing all that friction and you're servicing them. You're actually servicing them in the moment of need.
I think as well, AI is very exciting to be able to do that because it can dynamically display content or adapt it to you. So there's the channel or medium, and then it's making it contextual. So if you're speaking to a coach, having a contextual experience delivered in your flow is very exciting.
Totally.
But a lot of organizations I've spoken with, they do like a audience analysis, which seem to be somewhat similar to your customer journey mapping. And I think the idea that we want to be agnostic to where we deliver this content through different channels is really important. It doesn't really matter in the channel. It matters the mindset that you care deeply about the behavior and the habits of these users. Because as I'm sure you can agree, if you have X thousands of users, you're not going to change those behaviors. You're just building a barrier, which means people aren't engaging because it's not tailored to them in the way that they're used to having experiences.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we talk a lot about personalization. This has been a hot topic for several years. I really think that we're just still scratching the surface of what's actually possible with regards to personalization. But in order to do that effectively, it has to be multiple vectors. You have to be thinking about things from multiple different viewpoints. So customer segment is a big one. So you just alluded to this. So whether you're serving internal customers or external customers, again, doesn't really matter. But being able to granularly understand the needs of a particular segment, whether that be their preferred delivery method of that learning, whether that be the channel that they spend the most of their time on and therefore makes sense for you to try to deliver it there, whether that be the type of content based on their needs, based on their performance, based on the skills proficiency level that they're at, all those things. Like, you really need to understand your customer in order to do that well. So associated to your customer journey mapping, service design stuff is empathy mapping. Like, do you actually have a good sense of who you serve? Developing empathy maps. This is another thing that I learned from Chris really early on when I joined Docebo, and was another one of those things that I thought was so life-changing because it stretches so far beyond the things that we would normally think about as educators or marketers. Doesn't really matter what function you're in. You normally stick to pretty high level stuff like region, job title, these very, very basic things. But empathy mapping gets you one level much deeper than that to understand their needs, their pains. What are they trying to achieve? Their desires. What does their day-to-day actually really look like? And then taking all of those things into consideration when you segment your learners, your customers, lends itself to your ability to achieve personalization. And when you couple that with a channel strategy that makes sense so that you're reaching them at the right moment in time, also the journey mapping so that you know when the right content is best going to serve them and you deliver that at the right moment on their journey, all of those things combined get us to a place where personalization actually becomes possible. And that only is possible when you have the right data architecture and you're actually tracking all of those touch points and feeding that back into some sort of centralized data warehouse or system, whether that's your HRIS, CRM, or something completely separate. You need that to be able to correlate all of those touch points and all of that data to the person so that you can continue understanding, did it impact? Like, when I did that thing on this channel, did it achieve the desired result? And if not, why? Did they change jobs? Okay, so now I need to try again. AI is going to make this exceptionally easier than it has been in previous years, but I still think that we're a ways away from achieving like full-scale personalization.
So curious, from your consulting perspective, how have you kind of worked with customers from the journey mapping stage or the data stage going into channel? And do you have any kind of experiences of how people do that end to end?
So like, if step number one is the customer journey, well, step number one is actually the empathy mapping. I should have mentioned that earlier, but like, understand your customers first and foremost. Then do the customer journey mapping, identify friction within your company that's preventing you from being able to even deliver on an optimized experience. Once you have all of those friction points and you understand where the challenges exist, it's about selecting the most pressing ones. So using some sort of prioritization matrix. Cost of delay is a good one. That's what we were teaching, and Chris is still teaching in PX as a product. So it's really based around like, if we don't solve this particular pain point for the customer, what does that mean for our business? What are the possible things that could unfold if we just ignore it and we don't do anything about it? And that really helps to illustrate like the urgency of actually solving that particular problem, because if it's mission critical and it's going to continue contributing to churn or retention challenges with your employees, then obviously you want to be able to fix that. And so that helps you prioritize things. So you can kind of go through this exercise of taking all of the friction and pain points, prioritizing them based on whatever way you want to do things, cost of delay being a good one, and then connecting it back to the outcome that you want to see being driven, right? So, and this is the part that I think most teams, in my experience, I've seen skip and fail, unfortunately, because I think it's in our human nature to want to just jump to solution, right? It's like, okay, I see the pain point. I know exactly what to do because I've seen this before. Or, so-and-so, my 3 stakeholders are asking me for this thing. And so that seems like the right solution. So I'm just going to do it and I'm going to ship it. But what happens when you skip straight to solutioning and you ship something without actually thinking about prioritization and the desired outcomes and impact that you want to have, or how that's correlated to the business results that you expect to see for your function, you end up potentially creating solutions that are not the right solutions. So
Solutioning in a vacuum, essentially.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And again, like the solution that you're thinking of is one of maybe 30. There could be like a million different ways to solve the problem. So like taking the time to actually understand those leading indicators that you expect to have an impact on, and designing prototypes, experiments, even for just a short amount of time, to see if there are 3, 4, 5 different solutions, running experiments on those different things to see, did any of these actually move the needle? And then picking the best one, the most logical one that's actually going to drive that long-term impact you want to see. This is honestly one of the most powerful things that I've seen organizations do, because then you know that you're like creating a flywheel with your function. You're no longer just shipping stuff. You're no longer just creating content. You're actually doing things that are pushing the business in the right direction. And so then you can continue tweaking and optimizing and fixing because you're paying attention to the data and you understand the impact that you want to have. And that's what creates the momentum for teams to really have maximum impact and shift from, we talk about like shifting from cost center to profit center, or I want to have a seat at the table. It's like, that's how you do it. You really need to be very, very mindful about the outcomes that you're trying to drive and prove that they actually work.
The other idea there with solutioning in a vacuum, that's a really dangerous assumption in the AI era, because you pick the wrong use case for AI and you might go backwards rather than forwards. I also think what you mentioned there about the risk of inaction, or kind of that step of what's the most priority. I think this comes back to stakeholder mapping. To you is not most important to ops, IT, etc. So having that stakeholder journey, I think it's really interesting to put skills into that context, because skills is not just HR's issue, it's an organizationally wide. So when I was chatting to Sandra, she said a few of the toll gates she had for, are we building a skills-based organization, is if HR takes this to the rest of the business and you're not getting buy-in, kill the idea. It's an SBO in isolation and it's not necessarily going to work. But let's imagine then, Sam, that we are buying new people technology. It could be learning management systems, could be experience, could be skills platforms, and we're buying it for Acme Corp. And we're then designing the customer journey map. So the way I'm seeing this, and curious to kind of hear how you think people should go about it, is you do all this research pre-RFI or RFP. Otherwise, you don't know what you're asking for. So you're doing the research, you're doing the customer journey mapping, you're doing the stakeholder management. Let's say a year out, a year and a half, if you're a large enterprise org, and you're very clear on what we're trying to solve. And the reason I think this matters is if you enter tech partnerships and you're like, do you do skills? Do you do X or Y channel? It's too late. You already have 2 or 3 year partnerships with these vendors. You need to be clear on this up front. You're then building out these personas, which you can add to the RFP. You essentially go on the journey of asking for requests for information. You do demos, you do trials, proof of concepts, but you need that experience before. Otherwise, you buy the wrong tech. And with AI, it's so easy to buy that shiny new toy. So if you are tasked to consult someone who are doing the research and going through that buying process, how would you structure it? Is it similar to what I said? Any differences?
Yeah. Before even going through that exercise, like, it's not to say most teams have a general understanding of why they exist, right? Like whether you're customer ed or L&D, you kind of have it. Even if you're buying a brand new LMS for the very first time and standing up a fresh program, you likely generally have a sense of the outcomes that you're trying to drive. But the first thing that I think most people not necessarily skip, but make assumptions around without validating, and this prevents the seat at the table stuff that we often talk about, is like, get with your executive team and understand where the business is going and what are the top challenges that are preventing the business from reaching number one. So being able to hear and understand these are our goals. We want to grow to X ARR. Maybe we're on a path of acquiring some additional technology and rolling that into our total ecosystem. Having some clarity around those things, and then having clarity around the top challenges of the business. Are you experiencing some churn because maybe you grew, really quickly during the pandemic and you sold a bunch of like multi-year contracts, and now you're reaching that point where like, oh, we're starting to see some churn from these customers. What do we do about this, right? So that first and foremost is the entirety of your strategy, and designing in such a way that if you remove those challenges, you are inevitably going to drive the result that the business expects to see. Because when you build from that place, you already have the seat at the table. You don't have to prove your worth after the fact. You don't design programs, ship them, prove that we did something. Look, our onboarding program, we correlated some data and we showed that we had this impact. Doing that is, you're already doing it too late. So have the seat at the table first and foremost, align with your executive team, understand their challenges, design the strategy from there. And then usually the best thing to do is, once you understand those high level business objectives, you can break down your KPIs in a way that go from like whatever top challenges and whatever business objectives you're trying to reach. And you can sort of like trickle things down to lagging indicators for your function, and then eventually get to a point where you understand like, what's the tiniest little thing that I know that I can have an impact on that's indirectly connected to this long-term thing that I want to be able to drive for my business. Everything comes down to those things, because once you understand what those things are and you have a list of those leading indicators, you can design or understand what programs am I going to run to be able to move the needle on these things. And that dictates the technology that you're going to choose, right? Not the other way around. You don't go shopping around for an LMS or any other learning technology without understanding those things fundamentally. So that's usually the way that I recommend, is like, start with the business metrics, design all of your lagging down to leading indicators that you want to be able to have an impact on. Think about some of the programs that you might run that are going to lead to those leading indicators and subsequently lagging indicators. And then identify, sort of the features or capabilities that you think are going to help you execute on those programs that are going to help you execute on those KPIs.
So let's assume in a hypothetical world, people have done that research. They've picked the greatest vendor and they're now looking to do the implementation. Do you take the customer journey map and almost map quick wins or ways you could use that to get buy-in? And then you align that to which, let's say we roll out to 10 different regions. Which one goes first? Because I know they are struggling with X. This leader is more likely to be receptive. Like, how are you bringing that into the implementation side?
Well, this is where the prioritization comes in, right? So of all of those leading indicators that I know I can have an impact on, that might impact driving the business in the direction we want to see it, which ones are most critical right now based on the friction that we've identified across our customer journey map that are connected to those KPIs. There are common and standard KPIs across L&D and across customer education that we look for. Time to value is often one of them, whether that is internal or external. We want to be able to reduce time to value or ramp time in the context of an internal. And so if that's one of your top priorities, then of course you're going to want to think about structuring your technology in a way that's going to allow you to ship some sort of onboarding program first and foremost that's going to deliver on that specific outcome. If you know that your top challenge is, I don't know, you have a very heavy technical product and implementation always tends to be a challenge for you, then again, maybe shipping like some sort of technical onboarding certification program is going to be the right thing that moves the needle on that KPI.
And it's the definition of thinking of outcomes first, which I love how that process you're going through, and thinking of a product mindset. It forces you to get the inputs that you're then prioritizing and you're shipping the right product. So shipping an implementation of a learning system or doing your own product dev internally, it's the same process. It's the same kind of methodology. So I'm going to take this a little bit meta, but stay with me. So imagine everything we talked through. You make a customer journey map of, what you do initially. You're gathering research, stakeholder mapping, prioritization and you're shipping product, what are the main areas where people get stuck? You mentioned jumping to solutions too quick. So if you're trying to analyze this from kind of a bird's eye view, where do people go wrong along this journey?
Jumping to solutions too quickly is definitely one of them. Making assumptions about the impact that you can have instead of validating that it actually works. So I place such a high importance on prototyping and running experiments because I've seen it happen so often where teams will spend 6 months developing these really robust learning programs, really robust courses. They'll ship them. And usually it's like, oh, it's crickets. Like, I don't understand why people aren't engaging. And of course, their answer to that is, it must be a marketing problem. So we just need to market it more. And it's like, no, you just solved the wrong problem. You didn't bring them along for the journey. The prototyping and the experimentation is not only important because it helps you validate against the objectives that you had to make sure that you're actually moving that KPI that you wanted to, but almost more critically, it forces you to build with your users. It forces you to pull them into the experience really early on to co-create alongside you. And when that happens, when you have people who feel like they're completely bought into the experience, they're co-creating, they're part of the journey, they're going to go and talk about that with their friends, their employees, their other customers. That word is going to spread. You will have internal champions that will do the marketing for you so that when you actually get around to launching the thing, not only do you know it works, but you've already got people who have hyped it up for you. So engagement will inevitably go through the roof. That problem does end up getting solved. I think the other one that I would mention is the tracking piece. And I know that can be often challenging for a lot of teams to solve. Not everyone has access to a dedicated data scientist, let alone access to the data science team. Finding the people inside your organization who know their way around correlating data sets and having them support you in reviewing the KPIs and the objectives that you have, like the success metrics that you think you're going to be able to impact on, and then having them involved in the program design. They'll be able to help ensure that you're designing things in a way that will allow you to track, even if it's quite simple. It doesn't need to be, oh, we need this data warehouse. We need everything to be funneling, and we need like Tableau, fancy dashboards. But even just having someone who can walk you through, like, how do I run a very simple cohort analysis? Like, I'm going to feed this content to some people. I'm going to not give it to this other cohort of people. And I'm just going to see, did group A achieve X result that group B didn't? Great, validated. Like, that alone is so incredibly valuable to proving the impact that you want to have on the business. The one thing that I would call out for folks listening, because we've referred to this before as analytics maturity, there's this assumption that, oh, well, this last level of quote unquote maturity, or this like mecca that we want to get to of being able to correlate against business objectives and outcomes, that's complicated. And so I'm actually just going to focus on like level 1 and 2 for now, because this is what I have access to, or this feels like maybe a little easier for me to execute on. And I think that mentality is actually detrimental to teams' abilities to really get the buy-in to continue growing their programs and to be able to grow in their own maturity levels as a function. There are so many ways that you can test and validate against business KPIs, and that should always be priority number 1. Those other things are really critical so that you know whether your content is working and whether your learners are enjoying the experience. Those things all matter, but first and foremost, knowing that you've moved the needle on the business outcome is the most important thing, because it's the thing that's going to allow your team to continue growing and scaling and having the impact that you want to have.
So final fun question here, Sam. So it's one of the favorites on the pod. So if you can throw 3 things, and let's say experience design here, on the fire, and you bring 3 new things in, what would you throw of what currently teams are doing on the fire, and what would you bring in more of?
One of them would be just content outputs for the sake of content outputs. And I would replace that with outcomes, focusing on outcomes. When I think about teams who have as one of their objectives to improve product adoption, the default is to create a course that informs about that particular product or feature or capability. And we deliver that through an LMS. I'm going to be maybe a little controversial here and say, throw that out the window, throw that into the fire. Those are kind of useless. I would replace that with an in-app guide, some sort of embedded experience directly in the flow of the product that teaches them what they need to know and then gets out of the way. Like that should be the default behavior.
I'll throw some of mine on the fire.
Love it,
So
yeah.
the assumption that a course will solve everything. A course is one of the puzzle pieces you could use, but it's so often teams get a request and then they build the course.
Yes.
Like we need
That's a
the
good one.
Gandalf, thou shall not pass. Sometimes not every request should pass. Curious Corner takeaways. So just to summarize a little bit, Sam, we talked about your journey from doing jump ropes between vendor side, being a practitioner, now being a consultant. We talked about experience design and going through those steps from, understanding what you want to measure, the customer journey mapping, going that into looking at channels and delivery and keeping this product mindset throughout. And what we're also talked about is it seems like it's really worthwhile doing this because one, it's a helpful exercise to know what you're building, but two, if you don't, you're building the wrong solutions, which means you hurt your buy-in. So do your homework and do this before it's too late and something is blown up because it's not done it. So safe to say, this is a worthwhile endeavor to focus on experience design.
I want to call attention to something that you said earlier in our conversation. I think you said act like a scientist. This innate curiosity, we should all have that. When you're in the business of creating experiences for people, whether it's learning experiences or more traditional customer experiences more broadly, you're thinking about the experience of work for your employees, having an innate curiosity, playing detective a little bit, really going deep to understand underneath what they're complaining about on the surface, or they might be challenged with on the surface, what's actually going on under there? Follow the thread until you actually know underneath all those layers what the problem is and solve for that. It does require a bit of a scientist or detective mindset to be willing to go deep and have empathy for your users. You have to have empathy first and foremost to actually want to solve their problem. So I think some of those soft skills that we don't often talk about in these fields, they're actually so critical to our ability to being able to do all this stuff that we just talked about.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited because one of your friends I'm going to interview and release in another episode, Dave from Customer Education, he was an actual scientist. So very cool to dive into this from that perspective.
Yep.
And my final throw in the fire is thinking we're all in different camps. We've looked at this. A customer could be a user. It's internal, it's external. It's not that different. Yes, some of your channels and modalities are different between customer and employee, but it's the same thing. We're doing the same experiences. And I think closer collaboration and partnership rather than we're at a lunch table and I don't want to sit with that group and I don't want to sit with that group. That would make things better overall.
Create a center of excellence for learning. Just saying.
There you go. There you go. And I'll encourage anyone as well to check out all your stuff on LinkedIn, Sam, everything you're doing with AlignedCX and your whole consulting journey. So that's my final PSA. And thank you so much for joining the pod here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So that's it for this conversation. I'm going to keep going down rabbit holes as we explore the weird and wonderful world of learning and development. If you want my full wrap up and takeaways, subscribe to my newsletter where I'll connect all the dots.